She's faking it.
Claudia Reinhardt hissed, thrusting a crumpled violation notice into my chest. Your little ramp violates community design standards, and I don't care what sob story you have this week. Her tone was sharp enough to cut skin. Claudia, president of our HOA board, stood on my porch like she owned the entire street. Heels planted, clipboard ready, smug and certain she'd win this round. Behind her, the morning sunlight gleamed off the polished cars and matching mailboxes of Silver Pines Estates, the kind of place where people whispered instead of living. I didn't flinch. I just glanced down at the paper and said, "You might want to check the ADA section before you find me again." Her painted smile flickered for half a second, and I saw it, the small fracture in her confidence. If you've ever had someone threaten your child's independence in the name of aesthetic harmony, hit subscribe right now. Because what happens next will make you question what kind of power these HOAs think they have. My name's Daniel Mercer, I told her evenly, folding the paper in half. I'm a civil rights attorney, the kind that's written briefs on accessibility law longer than your entire rule book. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. There's a kind of power in staying calm while someone digs their own grave with every arrogant word. But she wasn't listening. They never do at first. She only saw what she wanted, a family that didn't fit her perfect picture, a father who refused to tear down a wheelchair ramp because his daughter needed it to leave the house. Lily was inside, watching from the window, 15 years old and already too familiar with the sound of judgment. She'd spent half her life proving to the world she could move without pity, that the accident didn't take everything from her. The ramp wasn't just wood and nails. It was her freedom, her morning sunlight, her link to normalcy. Claudia called it unsightly. I called it the line I wouldn't let anyone cross. Claudia circled the ramp, tapping her pen against the railing like she was inspecting a crime scene. This was built without board approval. You'll be fined $100 a day until it's removed. Non-compliance can result in lien action. Her words hit like static, but I'd already started mentally filing her mistakes. No mention of the ramp in the bylaws, no accessible modification clause, no legal disclaimer in her letterhead. My pulse steadied as hers rose. She had authority, but I had something stronger, proof. I'd seen people like her before, authority addicts. They disguise control as community, disguise prejudice as policy. She wanted me to beg, to apologize, to show fear. Instead, I watched her walk back to her silver SUV, high heels snapping against the pavement like a countdown clock. When she drove off, I leaned against the railing, the same one she'd tried to outlaw, and felt the faint grooves of Lily's initials carved into the wood. She'd done that the day she took her first steps after the accident, laughing through tears. I remember sanding the ramp by hand that night, the smell of pine mixing with hope. That ramp wasn't a modification. It was a promise. Now, Claudia wanted it gone because it didn't match the neighborhood's character. I looked around at the uniform lawns, the sterile perfection, the silence that smelled like money and fear. Maybe she was right. It didn't match. It was alive, like the girl who used it. Inside, Lily wheeled over, eyes searching mine. Is she serious? She's serious, I said quietly. But she's also wrong. I turned to the window and caught my reflection next to hers, father and daughter, defiant silhouettes framed by the wood she built her confidence on. Somewhere deep in my chest, a familiar stillness settled in. It was the same one I'd felt in court before a case turned, the same one that came before I exposed a system's weak spot. Claudia didn't know it yet, but the ramp she tried to erase would become the reason her entire empire fell. Out in the distance, the HOA sign gleamed in the morning sun. Silver Pines Estates, where order creates beauty. I smiled at the irony. Order was about to meet justice, and this time, it would lose. The next morning, the violation signs were already staked into my front lawn, bright orange warnings fluttering against the clean grass like some kind of public shaming ritual. Across the street, blinds twitched. Neighbors pretended to be watering their flowers or jogging, but everyone slowed down just long enough to stare. Silver Pines Estates wasn't built for confrontation. It was built for compliance, and Claudia Reinhardt knew exactly how to weaponize that. By the end of the week, 3 more envelopes arrived, each one thicker than the last, listing new fines and daily accrual penalties. The language was deliberately intimidating, words like non-compliance, violation, escalation, and lien preparation. I stacked them neatly on my desk. In my line of work, paper trails are both poison and cure. You just have to know which way the wind is blowing before you turn the page. I logged onto the HOA portal, scrolling through their so-called community updates. There it was, a newsletter post written by Claudia herself. Certain residents continue to disregard Silver Pines' aesthetic covenant. Enforcement measures are underway. No names, but everyone knew who she meant. The comments were polite daggers. So sad how some people think they're above the rules. Disgraceful, especially with children watching. I clicked print. If this was her opening move, then I already knew where she'd overstepped. The HOA's power wasn't infinite. It existed only within the boundaries of its charter. And if Claudia was rewriting those boundaries on the fly, she was opening a door I could step right through. Still, it wasn't the fines that stung, it was the effect on Lily. She used to roll outside in the mornings to watch the sunrise. Now she stayed behind the curtains, listening to the whispers. "It's fine, Dad," she said once when I asked why. "I just don't want them staring." Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the quiet weight of humiliation. I kept my answer simple. They don't get to decide who deserves sunlight. That night, I went through every email from the HOA. Timestamps, sender addresses, attachments. It was all standard until one detail caught my eye. Every message from Claudia's office carried a different footer disclaimer. Some said, Silver Pines HOA, Incorporated. Others had no registration line at all. Sloppy. I made a note, but didn't dig deeper yet. Patterns tell stories when you give them time to repeat. The next morning, I received a call from the HOA treasurer, a man named Jeff, who sounded more nervous than official. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice trembling. "Claudia asked me to remind you that the fines double if unpaid after 30 days. I asked one question. Jeff, can you send me the board's current incorporation certificate for my records?" A long pause, then, that's all handled through Claudia's files. I don't think I have access to that." Exactly what I expected. By evening, the pattern was clear. The HOA had power on paper, but only if that paper was valid. I'd seen this before in my legal career. Expired entities still swinging their weight like they were legitimate. They write fines, issue threats, and everyone obeys because fear is easier than research. Claudia was betting on that. She'd never met someone who could read a legal bluff in a single paragraph. But even strategy couldn't protect against emotion. Lily stopped going to school in person for a while. Kids whispered about the ramp case, and one parent even suggested removing her from a class photo until things are resolved. That word, resolved, burned. As if accessibility were an inconvenience waiting to be tidied up. I tried to hide my frustration, but anger seeps through the cracks no matter how steady your tone. Some nights I'd step outside and stare at that ramp glowing under the porch light, remembering the sound of Claudia's heels clicking down my driveway. The ramp wasn't just wood anymore, it was evidence. 2 weeks later, a new envelope arrived. This one marked urgent legal notice. Inside, Claudia had escalated again. She was threatening a civil claim for safety non-compliance and demanding immediate removal. The irony was thick enough to choke on, a woman breaking federal law to accuse me of endangering the public. I could have replied with a lawsuit right then, but I wanted her arrogance to grow. The higher she built her tower, the harder she'd fall when the foundation cracked. I started documenting every interaction, video timestamps, emails, photos. My office printer became a quiet accomplice. I didn't just want to win, I wanted it airtight. By the end of that week, the neighborhood had shifted. People were starting to whisper about the board's aggressive tactics. Someone anonymously slipped a note under my door. "She's been doing this for years. Most of us just give in." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about my ramp or my daughter. It was about the kind of fear that keeps good people quiet. And I don't do quiet. I didn't know who left the note under my door, but I knew where to start looking. Fear leaves patterns, and every pattern has a witness. In Silver Pines, that witness was Mark Ellison, the quiet man who sat inside the HOA's security booth like a forgotten relic. He'd retired from the police years ago, but old habits die slow. He still carried himself like someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. I found him that night at the edge of the cul-de-sac, the glow from his small booth spilling across the road. The air was heavy with summer heat, thick enough to hold secrets. He didn't look surprised to see me, just sighed and straightened his back, his hand unconsciously brushing the pocket where his badge used to be. "You shouldn't be out here after dark, Dan," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Claudia's already made this personal. You keep pushing her, it's not going to end clean." "I'm not the one breaking the law," I replied. "She is." Mark's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the small security camera above the booth, then back to me. "I didn't say you were wrong. I said it won't end clean." That hesitation, the way his hand fidgeted with his keyring, told me everything. He knew more than he could say. But loyalty is a tricky thing. People like Mark stay in the middle until something shoves them off balance. "You've seen what she's doing to my daughter?" I said quietly. "You think that's leadership?" He looked away again, lips pressed so tight the skin around his mouth went white. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped low. "I've been here since before Claudia took over. Used to be we had a real board, neighbors that cared. Then her husband passed, and she turned control into therapy. I stayed silent, letting him fill the space. He rubbed a hand across his face, eyes flicking toward the window blinds of nearby houses. People think she's protecting the neighborhood. They don't see how she keeps files on everyone. Photos, complaints, background checks. I told her it was too far once. She reminded me who signs my checks. There it was, the fracture line I'd been looking for. A man torn between his conscience and his paycheck. I'm not asking you to pick sides, Mark, I said, careful to keep my tone level. I just need you to remember what's right. He let out a bitter laugh, short and dry. You think right matters around here? These people worship her. You go up, as against Claudia, you'll be the next headline in the newsletter. She's already writing it, I said. But when this ends, she won't be president anymore. That's not a threat, it's just law catching up. Mark's gaze lingered on me then, studying my face the way a cop reads a suspect, searching for conviction, not bluster. You really think you can take her down? I don't think, I said. I know. For a moment, the only sound was the buzz of the sodium light overhead. Then he shifted, leaning forward in his chair, elbows on his knees. I've seen her do worse than this. The ramp thing. It's not the first. There was a veteran on Oak Street. Built a flagpole without permission. She fined him until he moved out. He exhaled through his teeth, shaking his head. Man lost his house over a flag. He fell quiet, staring down at his hands. They trembled slightly, the way a man shakes when he's done looking away, but hasn't yet decided to act. You didn't hear that from me, he muttered. I won't quote you, I said. But one day, you'll want to stand on the right side of this. Mark looked up sharply, eyes narrowing. And what side's that? The one that doesn't use fear to keep order. He didn't answer. His fingers tapped against the desk in slow, uneven rhythm, an old nervous tick maybe. The sound reminded me of a countdown. When I turned to leave, he called after me. You know, Claudia's got connections downtown. City inspector, even a deputy clerk. You start poking holes, they'll close ranks. I paused at the curb. Then I'll dig deeper. Mark didn't speak again, but when I looked back, he was watching me with the expression of a man who wanted redemption and didn't yet know how to earn it. His hand hovered over the radio, not to report me, but like he was rehearsing what courage might feel like when he finally pressed the button. That was the moment I knew. Silver Pines wasn't loyal to Claudia out of belief. It was loyal out of fear, and fear in my world was the easiest thing to dismantle. The next morning, fear had a face again. Claudia Reinhardt's, framed perfectly against the polished oak of the HOA conference table. Her smile was tight, practiced, and venomous. I hadn't been invited to the meeting, but that didn't stop her from mentioning me in front of the board like I was an urban legend. Through the glass walls of the HOA office, I could see her pacing, gesturing toward my name on a stack of printed letters. I stood outside, silent, watching her power unravel in real time. Her voice carried even through the door. If we let Mercer defy us, everyone else will follow. He thinks he's special because of that. Structure. She hesitated before saying the word ramp, like it tasted wrong in her mouth. We can't let emotion dictate enforcement. Inside, the board members nodded like wind-up dolls, each terrified of being. Next, when she finally stepped out, she froze. Daniel, she said, forcing a smile. This isn't the place for you. I know, I replied, but the courthouse is. Her eyes narrowed, the smile thinning. You've filed something. Not yet, I said, just documenting every violation of federal accessibility law. Don't worry, you'll get your copy. The composure slipped for a second. It was small, but it was there, the twitch in her jaw that betrayed fear. She adjusted her blouse, turning away before she could be seen unraveling. You can't intimidate me with your credentials. I don't need to, I said quietly. The law already did. By the time I walked back to my car, I could feel the neighborhood's silence pressing in from all sides. Word traveled fast in Silver Pines. Within hours, neighbors were whispering about how Daniel confronted the board and Claudia's losing her grip. The ripple had begun. That afternoon, a bright yellow notice was taped across my front door. It wasn't a fine this time. It was an official threat of lien and property seizure. My daughter saw it before I did. I came home to find her sitting on the porch, the paper clutched in her hands, her face pale. Are they taking our house? She asked. No, I said, crouching beside her. They're trying to scare us. She looked down at the paper again, her voice trembling. I just wanted to go outside. I didn't ask for any of this. The words cut deeper than she knew. I'd spent my career defending people who couldn't fight back. Now my own daughter was learning what injustice looked like up close. That night, the rain came, slow at first, then relentless. The ramp glistened under the downpour, the water collecting in small rivulets that shimmered beneath the porch light. I watched it from the living room window, laptop open. HOA bylaws pulled up beside federal ADA case law. Somewhere in that overlap of arrogance and ignorance, Claudia's undoing was waiting. When I reached Article 9 of their governing document, I stopped. Every HOA, by law, has to list its registration number, renewal date, and corporate status. Silver Pine's document had none of it, just a vague reference to board authority under state statute. My pulse quickened. If they'd failed to renew their corporate charter, every fine, every notice, every threat was legally meaningless. I opened the state's public record portal, typing Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association. No results. I tried alternate spellings. Nothing. My hand tightened around the mouse. This wasn't a clerical error, it was negligence. They'd lost their legal standing and kept operating anyway. Outside, thunder rolled like punctuation. The next day I drove to the county clerk's office. The smell of paper and dust hit me as I stepped inside. A familiar battlefield. I asked the clerk for the most recent filing on Silver Pines. Estates. She flipped through the database and frowned. That HOA hasn't renewed since last March, she said. They're inactive. Inactive. The word echoed like a verdict. I thanked her, took a printout of the record, and walked out into the light rain. It wasn't just about my ramp anymore. It was about every homeowner Claudia had bullied into submission under false authority. She'd been swinging a dead sword, and now I had the proof. When I got home, Lily was waiting by the door. "Did you find something?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. More than something. I found her foundation. Her eyes brightened, hope flickering back where fear had lived. That night, as rain tapped softly against the window, I laid the document beside the stack of fines Claudia had mailed me. One by one, I flipped through them, reading the empty threats of a powerless organization pretending to be law. The ramp outside stood firm, untouched, defiant. And for the first time, so did I. By morning, the rain had dried, but the air still carried the heaviness of something about to change. I drove downtown to the courthouse, clutching the clerk's printout that proved Silver Pines Estates hadn't renewed its corporate charter. The ink was barely dry, but it felt like a weapon forged perfectly for the kind of war Claudia Reinhardt had started. Inside the courthouse, I found a quiet corner near the ADA compliance office, a place I'd visited countless times for other clients, but never for myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. I filled out the official complaint, attaching copies of the fines and photographs of the ramp, each one marked with the HOA's now defunct letterhead. When I handed the folder to the clerk, she looked up and said, "You're not just filing for accessibility, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm filing for every homeowner she's ever scared." By noon, word of the filing had reached Silver Pines. I knew because my phone began buzzing nonstop. Anonymous messages from neighbors, some thanking me quietly, others warning me to stop. Power makes people brave in whispers and silent in daylight, but one message stood out. It came from an unknown number, just 2 words. "She knows." I looked out my office window to see Claudia's silver SUV parked across the street. She was sitting in the driver's seat, sunglasses on, watching my house like a predator pretending to be patient. I stepped onto the porch and met her gaze from 50 feet away. She didn't wave, she didn't leave, she just smirked, then slowly rolled down her window. "Legal tricks won't save you," she said, voice carrying easily across the quiet street. "You're still violating community standards." I walked closer until I could see my reflection in her window. "You might want to check which community still legally exists," I said, "because yours expired last March." Her face tightened. "You think paperwork matters?" "To the state," I said. "It's the only thing that matters." She drove off with a screech of tires that cut through the silence like a scream. That night, I could feel the shift. The HOA emails stopped coming, replaced by silence, an unnatural quiet that made even the crickets seem cautious. I knew what was coming next. People like Claudia don't admit defeat, they double down. Sure enough, at sunrise, I was served a notice from a private attorney, filed under Reinhardt versus Mercer. She was suing me personally for defamation, harassment, and unauthorized modification of property standards. It was absurd, but strategically clever. She was trying to drag me into court before the state could dissolve her authority. I sat at my kitchen table, the lawsuit spread out beside my coffee. Lily wheeled in quietly, rubbing her eyes. "Another letter?" "Worse," I said. "She's trying to make it official." Lily frowned, her hands gripping the armrests. "Can she really do that?" "Not if the HOA doesn't exist," I said, sliding the clerk's document toward her. "And it doesn't." She looked at the page, reading the bold stamp that said, "Inactive entity. Administrative dissolution." Her lips parted in disbelief. "So, all of this, every fine, every threat, It's nothing? Exactly, I said. Every notice she posted was just paper dressed as power. The realization settled over both of us like sunlight after a storm. For the first time in months, I saw her smile. Later that day, I drove to meet the ADA investigator assigned to my complaint. His office was small, cluttered with case files and framed photos of ramps, elevators, and modified homes, the unsung monuments of quiet justice. He listened carefully as I explained the HOA's actions, flipping through the evidence I'd brought. When I mentioned the expired charter, he paused. That changes everything, he said. If the HOA is not legally active, they can't enforce or defend anything. Every penalty they've issued is void, every restriction unenforceable. This isn't just an ADA issue, it's fraud. He promised to forward the findings to the state attorney's office. As I walked out, I could feel the entire narrative shifting under my feet. Claudia thought she'd cornered me in a maze of rules. But she'd built that maze on air. That evening, I sat on the porch watching the sunset reflect off the ramp's polished railings. The neighborhood was still. A few houses away, I saw Mark Ellison standing by his security truck, hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching my house with an unreadable expression. He didn't wave, but he nodded, slow and deliberate, like someone who'd just decided which side of the story he belonged to. I nodded back. The battle wasn't over, but the balance had changed. Claudia still had noise and influence, but I had proof, and in law, proof always outlasts intimidation. By the end of that week, the quiet was gone. Silver Pines pulsed with tension, the kind you could feel even with your windows closed. Cars slowed when they passed my driveway. Neighbors avoided eye contact. The HOA had always ruled with the threat of exclusion, and now that I'd defied them, everyone was afraid of catching the fallout. Lily tried to ignore it, but she noticed everything. That morning, as I loaded files into my briefcase, she said, "They stopped saying hi at the mailboxes." I looked up. "You still go to the mailboxes?" She smiled faintly. "It's the only ramp they can't fine us for." Her humor cut through the gloom for a moment, but only for a moment. Claudia wasn't done. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the county clerk, a formal notice that she'd filed for a restraining order, claiming I'd harassed board members through legal intimidation. She was trying to paint me as the aggressor. It was desperate, but dangerous. I drove straight to the county courthouse to verify the filing. The clerk recognized me instantly. "Mr. Mercer, I was just processing your ADA case this morning. You're moving fast." "She's trying to move faster," I said, sliding Claudia's letter across the counter. "This was filed under a defunct HOA. That's the same entity you told me last week was inactive." The clerk scanned it and frowned. "It's invalid. They can't use the HOA name in court without reinstatement." I exhaled, tension easing just enough to let anger take its place. Then it's time someone reminded her what invalid means. Outside, the sun was bright and merciless. I leaned against my car, dialing Mark Ellison's number. He answered on the second ring, voice low and wary. "Dan, you shouldn't call me here. Claudia's already asked if I've been talking to you." "Then stop lying for her," I said. "You know she's using HOA funds to pay for this private lawsuit. That's embezzlement, Mark, and it's not just her name on those checks." Silence, then a sigh. "You really want to bring the state into this? I'm already halfway there." He hesitated, the weight of old loyalties heavy in the pause. "Meet me behind the maintenance shed tonight," he said finally. "You didn't hear that from me." When I arrived, dusk was settling over the neighborhood. The shed stood near the tennis courts, quiet, empty, the kind of place where truth hides before it's ready to come out. Mark was there, leaning against his truck, arms crossed. "You're playing with fire," he said, voice low. "She's got people on the board who owe her favors." "I don't need favors," I replied. "I have facts." He looked at me for a long time, then reached into his jacket pocket. "I shouldn't have this," he said, handing over a flash drive. "Meeting recordings. Claudia keeps everything digital. She doesn't delete, just renames the files. The one labeled Maintenance Budget Discussion. Listen, carefully." "Why are you giving me this now?" I asked. His jaw flexed. "Because she's not just going after you. She told the board she wants to set a precedent. That means anyone who questions her next. I'm done watching her break people to keep control." I nodded. "You're doing the right thing." He gave a short, bitter laugh. If there were any right left, she'd have lost her job months ago. Later that night, I played the recording in my office. Claudia's voice filled the room, sharp, rehearsed, every word dripping with authority. Since the renewal fee wasn't paid, we'll continue operations under the assumption of authority. Residents won't check the registry. If Mercer presses it, we'll bury him in liens until he settles or moves. That single line was the nail in her coffin. It wasn't just negligence anymore, it was intent. Fraud. in her own voice. I sat back, staring at the waveform on my screen. Outside, the crickets hummed like a metronome, counting down to her collapse. When Lily wheeled in, rubbing her eyes, I lowered the volume. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head. "Neither could you." I smiled faintly. "No, but for a better reason." "What reason?" she asked. "Because tomorrow," I said, "we stop being the story she tells and start being the evidence that ends her." Lily tilted her head, studying me. "You really think it's over?" "Not yet," I said, "but it's close enough to taste." I looked out the window toward the HOA office, glowing faintly in the distance. Claudia didn't know it yet, but the sound of her own voice was about to become the most damning evidence in Silver Pine's history. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No return address, no HOA letterhead, just my name in shaky handwriting. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, the kind pulled from a cheap notepad. The note read, "Meet me at the diner off Highway 4, noon. Don't bring anyone." The signature at the bottom was faint but familiar. Mark. The last time we'd spoken, he'd handed me the flash drive that proved Claudia knew the HOA's corporate charter had expired. That alone could end her career, but apparently, he wasn't finished. Something about the note felt heavier, like it was written by a man standing on the edge of a decision he couldn't undo. At noon sharp, I pulled into the cracked parking lot of Roxy's Diner, a place where the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions clung to everything. Mark was already there, sitting in the corner booth. His security uniform looked rumpled, his tie loose, eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. He didn't wave, he just nodded once, as if acknowledging the inevitable. When I slid into the booth, he didn't look up right away. His hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, knuckles white. "You got the drive working?" he asked quietly. "I did," I said, "and I heard everything." He nodded, exhaling hard through his nose. "Then you know it's bad, but there's more, stuff I didn't tell you." I waited, giving him space. He stared at the window for a long moment, watching cars slide past in the heat shimmer. "You ever do something because you thought it'd protect people, and then realize all it did was help the wrong one?" "All the time," I said. Mark gave a humorless laugh. "Figures, you're a lawyer." He rubbed his temples, the tension written all over his body. "Claudia, she's been paying herself out of HOA funds for years, calling it consulting fees. When the board questioned it, she threatened to release private complaints, photos, emails, stuff she should have deleted years ago." I leaned forward. "And you have proof?" He nodded. "Ledger files. She made me back up her hard drive every quarter. I've still got copies on the HOA server." He looked down, voice cracking. "I didn't stop her because she promised me something. Said she'd cover my son's medical bills through the HOA's community fund. I didn't know that fund was fake." The shame in his voice was real and heavy. He pressed his palms together like a man praying for absolution. "When I found out, I tried to confront her. She laughed, said no one would believe a washed-up ex-cop over her." I studied him. "You came forward now because you want redemption?" "No," he said, "because I want her to stop before she ruins someone else. She's planning something, Dan, a public stunt." "What kind of stunt?" He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door like he expected Claudia to walk in any second. "She's scheduling an emergency board meeting this Friday. Says it's to address escalating defiance. She's going to accuse you of fraud in front of the neighborhood. She'll make it look like your ramp's tied to some grant scam. And she's invited a local reporter." That explained her sudden silence. She wasn't retreating. She was staging the finale. "She's walking into her own trial," I said quietly. Mark's eyes met mine. "Then make sure she doesn't walk out of it clean." He reached into his jacket and slid over a small USB stick. "The ledger, every fake transfer, every unauthorized withdrawal. Her signature's on most of them." I stared at it for a long moment. "If I use this, she'll come after you?" He gave a tired shrug. "She already has. Fired me this morning." That hit harder than I expected. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. "I've been her shadow for too long. It's about time I stepped into the light." We sat in silence as the waitress refilled our coffees. He didn't touch his. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, where sunlight spilled across the parking lot like a promise of something cleaner than the world we'd been living in. When I finally stood to leave, he said quietly, "If anything happens to me, make sure my son knows I tried to do one thing right." I nodded once. "You just did." Back in my car, I plugged the drive into my laptop and saw the files. Dozens of them, each time-stamped, each a nail in Claudia's coffin. By the time I closed the lid, I wasn't just holding evidence. I was holding the turning point. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting behind the rows of perfect rooftops, each one glowing with the illusion of order that Claudia Reinhardt had built and ruled for years. The flash drive from Mark Ellison felt heavier than metal in my pocket. Inside it was the sum of every false promise, every dollar she'd stolen, every life she'd tried to control. And in 48 hours, she planned to hold her grand board meeting to turn the neighborhood against me. She didn't know she was walking into her own cross-examination. I locked the front door, sat at my desk, and opened the files. Spreadsheets, transfers, and scanned checks filled the screen, everyone bearing Claudia's looping signature. The withdrawals were disguised as maintenance projects and community improvement stipends, but none of them led to real contractors or materials. One line item caught my eye: Rehabilitation Fund allocation, $6,300. The memo field read, medical expense, Ellison family. It wasn't charity, it was bribery. I printed the records and cross-referenced each transaction with county vendor reports. None of them matched legitimate accounts. She'd been embezzling under the HOA's name, an entity that no longer legally existed. Every payment was an act of fraud layered on top of fiction. I took photos of the screen and uploaded everything to a secure folder with timestamps. When you've lived your life in courtrooms, you learn that truth only wins when it's bulletproof. The sound of the printer filled the room like steady breathing. Lily rolled in quietly, her hands stained with pencil graphite from sketching. "You're working late again," she said. "Almost done," I replied, forcing a smile. "We're getting close." She looked at the mountain of papers. "Does it make any of it better?" "It makes it right," I said. "That's the only kind of better we get in this world." She studied me for a long moment, then reached into her lap and handed me one of her drawings. It was the ramp, drawn in perspective, sunlight glinting off it, her initials carved into the railing. "You always see it as a legal fight," she said softly. "I see it as a promise." Her words hit harder than any argument. I placed the drawing beside my notes, a reminder of why this war had to end cleanly. The next morning, I drove to my downtown office, a quiet space above a shuttered bookstore. I spread the evidence across the table and built my case the way I'd built dozens before, methodically, mercilessly, leaving no room for doubt. For every transaction Claudia signed, I attached a corresponding statute. For every dollar she redirected, I linked an active state law she violated. I included the state record confirming Silver Pines' corporate dissolution and framed it at the top of the packet like a header carved into marble. Entity status, inactive, authority, void. By the time I was done, the stack of documents stood almost 2 inches thick. I labeled it simply, Mercer versus Silver Pines, HOA, Reinhardt, Claudia, individual. The lawsuit would do more than clear my name. It would erase her entire illusion of power. That afternoon, I met with the ADA investigator again. He listened as I explained the new evidence, flipping through the printouts with a whistle of disbelief. "She was paying herself from non-existent accounts?" he asked. "Using an HOA that doesn't legally exist," I said, "and leveraging it to intimidate homeowners under the threat of lien and seizure." He nodded slowly. "I'll fast-track this to the state attorney's office. But with this much evidence, you don't need us. You can bury her in civil court before they even move." "That's the plan," I said. When I left the building, I felt the first hint of victory, a quiet pulse behind my ribs, measured, controlled. But it wasn't triumph I wanted. It was finality. That evening, the neighborhood was unusually alive. Groups of residents clustered on sidewalks, whispering about the emergency meeting. Flyers had been slipped under every door, each stamped with Claudia's name and the HOA seal she no longer had the right to use. The meeting would be held in the community center, neutral ground that would soon become her undoing. Mark texted me around dusk. "She doesn't know I gave you the ledger, but she suspects." "Be careful," I replied. "It's almost over." He sent one final message, "Then make it count." That night, I organized my evidence into a binder, sectioned by timestamp and violation type. On top, I placed Lily's drawing of the ramp. It wasn't just proof of what was at stake, it was the reason I hadn't quit. Outside, the porch light glowed softly against the ramp's polished wood, the same ramp that had started everything. 2 days from now, I'd walk into that meeting with every record she'd forged, every word she'd lied, every neighbor she'd bullied, and show them exactly what kind of power Claudia Reinhardt really had. None at all. 2 days later, the community center parking lot was packed, rows of cars lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. Every porch light in Silver Pines seemed to point here tonight. The emergency HOA meeting Claudia Reinhardt had called wasn't just a formality. It was her attempt to reclaim the throne. Inside, folding chairs filled the main hall, and neighbors murmured in low, uneasy tones. I stood at the back, binder in hand, the faint smell of burnt coffee and cheap carpet mixing with the electricity of expectation. Claudia stood at the podium, perfectly composed in a tailored blue suit, her hair immaculate as ever. She looked every inch the president she claimed to be, except she wasn't. Not anymore. She leaned toward the microphone with practiced warmth. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know there's been confusion regarding recent events, but tonight we're going to clear the air." I could almost admire her composure. Fear disguised as control is still a kind of art. She glanced toward me at the back, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "Before we proceed," she said, "I'd like to address the ongoing disruption caused by one homeowner, Mr. Daniel Mercer." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "His illegal structure has violated community code, and his defamatory claims have threatened our neighborhood's reputation. I've invited a journalist from the Silver Pines Chronicle to document tonight's proceedings. That last part was deliberate. Public humiliation as strategy. I'd seen it before. Weaponized shame, designed to make the target lose composure. But she was playing in my arena now. I waited until she finished her carefully rehearsed speech, then walked forward, each step echoing across the floor. "Mind if I speak?" I asked. She forced a brittle smile. "Briefly, Mr. Mercer. Let's keep this civil." "Oh, it will be." I placed the binder on the table next to the podium, unlatched it, and turned it toward the crowd. "What you're looking at," I said, "are official state records showing that Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association hasn't existed as a legal entity since March of last year. Every fine, every lien, every notice sent since then, invalid. Every dollar collected under that authority, fraudulent." The room erupted in whispers. Claudia's smile faltered, but only slightly. "That's absurd. Our registration?" "Expired," I said, sliding a printed copy of the state database record toward her. "Inactive. No renewal, no authority, no standing, and before you call it an oversight..." I opened the next page, revealing a spreadsheet of transactions from her own accounts. "These are payments made to yourself, labeled as consulting fees, drawn from an HOA that doesn't exist, all backed up by state banking records and confirmed by internal data provided by your former security officer, Mark Ellison." The name hit her like a slap. Her eyes darted toward the back of the room, where Mark stood half in shadow, arms crossed, face unreadable. Claudia's voice rose an octave. "You have no right to access private records." "I didn't," I said calmly. "He did. He was ordered to back up your files for board archives. You forgot to erase the part where you told your members, and I quote, 'If Mercer presses it, we'll bury him in liens until he settles or moves.'" The crowd went dead silent. Even the journalist stopped typing. A man in the front row, a neighbor named Paul who'd once been fined for a misplaced trash can, stood up. "Is that true, Claudia?" She didn't answer. Her throat moved, but no sound came. I turned toward the audience. "You've all been paying dues to a ghost corporation, led by someone who's been using your money to fund personal expenses. The law calls that embezzlement. And as of this morning, the state attorney's office has been forwarded the evidence." Murmurs turned to outrage. Someone shouted, "You took our money!" Another, "You threatened my wife over garden lights." Claudia's composure cracked. "This is slander!" she cried, pounding the podium. "You can't..." I cut her off. "Save it for court." Mark stepped forward then, his voice steady but low. "She's telling the truth," he said to the crowd. "Everything he showed you, it's real. I backed up those files myself, and I kept them because I knew someday she'd go too far." His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear. "That day's tonight." The room turned against Claudia in an instant. People began standing, demanding explanations. The journalist's camera flashed like lightning. Claudia stumbled back from the podium, color draining from her face. For once, her words failed her completely. I picked up the binder, closed it, and met her eyes. "This isn't personal," I said. "It's accountability." As I walked out, the sound of her neighbors shouting her name filled the hall, each voice another nail sealing the coffin of her reign. And for the first time, the silence outside Silver Pines wasn't fear. It was freedom. The night air outside the community center was thick with noise. Neighbors spilling into the parking lot, phones out, voices overlapping. The spell Claudia Reinhardt had cast over Silver Pines for years had finally shattered, and the sound of it breaking was louder than any argument she'd ever won. I stood beside my car, binder still in hand, watching her crumble through the glass doors. She was surrounded by the same people who once bowed to her, now shouting questions she couldn't answer. For the first time, she looked small. Mark joined me a few minutes later, his face pale in the flickering light from a nearby street lamp. "You did it," he said quietly. She's finished. I shook my head. Not yet. Tonight was exposure. The law comes next. He nodded slowly, eyes scanning the angry crowd. She won't go quietly. I'm counting on that, I said. Every word she says now will dig her deeper. A siren wailed in the distance. Someone must have called the police when the shouting started. By the time the patrol car pulled up, half the neighborhood was filming. The officer spoke briefly with a few residents before approaching Claudia. She tried to maintain her posture, waving her hands and insisting it was all a misunderstanding of bookkeeping. But then one of the officers stepped forward and handed her a notice, an official summons. Mark exhaled, softly. State attorney's office didn't waste time. I didn't reply. Watching her face twist as the officer explained the document was satisfaction enough. Her authority, her arrogance, her entire illusion. It was dissolving under the fluorescent lights. The officer glanced toward me and nodded. Mr. Mercer? Yes. Thank you for your cooperation. You'll be contacted if testimony is needed. Claudia's eyes burned into me. You think this makes you a hero? She snapped. You embarrassed a woman trying to protect her neighborhood. From what? I asked. Accessibility or accountability? She didn't answer. The officers guided her toward the parking lot as the crowd parted, whispering, filming, remembering. The same neighbors who once hid behind their blinds were now holding their phones high, capturing justice like proof it could still exist here. When her SUV finally disappeared down the street, the tension didn't vanish. It shifted. People began murmuring to each other, not in anger this time, but confusion. The HOA board members, stripped of direction, stood in a corner like stunned children. One of them, a man named Jeff, approached me cautiously. What happens now? He asked. The HOA dissolves, I said. The state will appoint a trustee to audit the accounts. After that, the residents decide whether to reform under new leadership or not at all. He looked relieved. Maybe it's time we started acting like neighbors again. Maybe, I said, but you'll have to prove it to the people she hurt. He nodded and walked away. Mark lingered beside me, still uneasy. You think she'll actually face charges? She filed under a non-existent corporation and took money from it, I said. That's fraud, misuse of public office, and embezzlement. The law won't need much convincing. He rubbed the back of his neck. I should have done something sooner. You did now, I said. That's what counts. The next morning, the neighborhood was eerily calm. The HOA sign at the entrance, polished metal reading Silver Pines Estates, where order creates beauty, had been spray-painted overnight. Someone had crossed out order and written freedom. I drove past it on my way to the courthouse, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Inside, I filed a motion for declaratory judgment to officially invalidate all HOA actions taken during their inactive period. It was a quiet formality, but the final step in ensuring their power never returned. The clerk recognized my name, slid the stamped papers across the counter, and said, "Looks like you've done this town a favor." I just stopped pretending rules matter more than people, I replied. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Lily asked if she could go outside again. For weeks she'd avoided the ramp, but now she wheeled herself down it slowly, the golden light catching her hair. The air smelled clean, different somehow. Feels weird, she said softly, like it's really over. It's not over, I said. It's starting again, this time right. She smiled, looking at the horizon. Do you think they'll rebuild the board? Maybe, I said. But this time, they'll answer to us. From somewhere down the block, the sound of hammers echoed, a neighbor removing one of the old HOA notice boards. For the first time since moving here, I didn't feel watched. I felt home. Silver Pines would heal, slowly but surely. And as for Claudia Reinhardt, her reckoning had only just begun. 2 weeks later, the courthouse steps were overflowing. Cameras, reporters, neighbors, and even a few city officials gathered under the noon sun, waiting for the hearing that would officially dissolve the Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association. Word had spread fast. HOA president faces, fraud charges after disabled girl targeted. And by the time I arrived, the story had already become bigger than our neighborhood. People wanted to see justice done. They wanted to see Claudia Reinhardt fall. Lily sat beside me at the base of the steps, her chair gleaming in the light, her hand resting calmly over mine. Mark Ellison stood off to the side near the courthouse door, his security badge replaced by a plain gray suit. The faint tremor in his hand was gone. He looked steady now, like a man who'd finally put his ghosts to rest. When Claudia's car pulled up, the crowd shifted like a tide. She stepped out, flanked by 2 attorneys, her confidence still intact, or at least pretending to be. She wore her signature pearl necklace, chin high, expression carefully composed for the cameras. But there was no applause this time, no polite smiles from neighbors. Only murmurs, phones raised, and the low hum of resentment. Her attorney tried to usher her forward, but a voice cut through the crowd. "That's the woman who fined me for a kid's bicycle." Another joined in. "She threatened to take my house over a bird feeder." The noise built until Claudia froze mid-step, the same poise she once used to control a boardroom, now wilting under the public's glare. The courthouse doors opened, and a uniformed officer gestured for both legal teams to enter. As she passed, Claudia's gaze met mine. "Enjoy your moment," she whispered coldly. "They always turn on their heroes next." "Then I'll take my chances," I said. Inside, the courtroom was packed, neighbors lining the benches, reporters along the back wall, and the judge presiding with calm authority. The clerk called the case, her voice echoing off the marble walls. State of California versus Claudia Reinhardt, Silver Pines Estates HOA, dissolved. Her attorney rose first, spinning a narrative of misunderstanding. "My client merely acted in the best interest of community standards," he said smoothly. "Administrative lapses were clerical, not criminal. And as for Mr. Mercer, his vendetta stems from personal animosity." I let him talk. The louder he spoke, the weaker the argument became. When it was my turn, I rose, adjusting my tie. "Your Honor," I began, "this isn't about vendettas or misunderstandings. This is about a person who abused authority she no longer had, who weaponized power to punish compliance itself. And it's about the people sitting behind me, each of them fined, threatened, and humiliated for rules that legally didn't exist." I handed over the binder. Inside are records of over 60 transactions labeled as HOA expenses, funds withdrawn under a corporate entity the state officially dissolved 15 months ago. The law is clear. Without legal standing, every action taken in the HOA's name was void, and every dollar spent was theft. The judge flipped through the evidence silently. When she reached the printout showing the inactive status, her brow furrowed. "This is confirmed by the Secretary of State?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "Filed and time-stamped." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Claudia sat motionless, her jaw set, eyes forward. But when the judge asked if she wished to respond, her restraint snapped. "This is a witch hunt," she shouted. "That man," she pointed directly at me, "has manipulated everyone here with lies. My only crime was trying to maintain order." "Order built on fraud," I said evenly. The judge struck the gavel once. "Mrs. Reinhardt, that's enough." Mark stood then, clearing his throat. The judge acknowledged him as a witness. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I worked for her. She told the board to continue operations after the charter expired, said no one would ever check the registry. I kept the backups. Everything he's saying is true." His words silenced the last of Claudia's protests. Even her lawyers stopped writing. The judge leaned forward. "This court will forward these findings to the district attorney for formal charges. Pending that, I am ordering the immediate dissolution of the Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association and a restitution audit for all residents affected." The gavel came down again, final, decisive, echoing like thunder. Outside, the crowd erupted. Cameras flashed, neighbors hugged, reporters shouted questions. Mark stood beside me, his voice barely audible over the noise. "You really did it, Dan." I looked toward Lily, who was smiling through tears. "No," I said. "We did." When Claudia exited the courthouse, she faced a wall of cameras and a sea of faces that once feared her. Now, they only looked at her the way people look at broken statues, remnants of power that no longer mattered. And standing there, in that noise, I realized something. Justice isn't quiet. It's the sound of truth finally being louder than fear. When the courthouse emptied, the noise faded into something softer, a kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but earned. I stood at the base of the steps, binder tucked beneath my arm, watching neighbors scatter across the plaza. For months, Silver Pines had been a place of fear and compliance, but now, people walked like the air itself was lighter. Lily wheeled forward beside me, sunlight gleaming off her chair's rims, her face calm for the first time since this began. Mark Ellison lingered near the sidewalk, his jacket slung over his shoulder. When our eyes met, he gave a single nod. The kind men give when words aren't enough. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He'd done his part. He'd carried the weight long enough. I looked up at the courthouse doors, where Claudia Reinhardt had stood minutes earlier, her final glare dissolving beneath a dozen camera flashes. The judge's ruling still echoed in my mind. Immediate dissolution, restitution, referral for prosecution. The system she built to control people had collapsed beneath the same laws she thought she could twist. It wasn't just justice, It was equilibrium. Lily tugged at my sleeve. Dad? Yeah? Can we go home now? The word home caught me by surprise. For months it had sounded like a battlefield. Now it felt like a promise. We drove back through the neighborhood in silence. The old HOA sign stood at the entrance, the spray-painted word, freedom, still visible through half-scrubbed silver paint. Someone had tried to cover it up, but it refused to vanish completely, like truth written too deeply to erase. When we pulled into the driveway, the house felt different. The orange violation stakes were gone. The warning stickers had been peeled off the mailbox. The ramp, our ramp, stood untouched, glowing in the afternoon light. The same piece of wood Claudia once called unsightly now stood as a monument to something bigger than defiance. Lily wheeled forward, touching the railing. "It's still here," she said quietly. "It always was," I told her. A few neighbors stopped on the sidewalk. People I hadn't spoken to in months, families who once crossed the street to avoid eye contact, were waving now. One of them, the man who'd been fined for his trash can, smiled awkwardly. "We're holding a neighborhood meeting next week," he said. "Without her this time. Thought maybe you'd help us rewrite the rules." I nodded slowly. "I'll help, but not as your lawyer." He frowned. "Then as what?" "As your neighbor." For a long moment, no one said anything. Then he smiled, genuine this time. "That's a good start." As the sun sank low, I stood on the porch and looked around. The lawns were imperfect now, patches of real life where control used to live. A kid's basketball rolled down the street, bumping softly against the curb. A dog barked somewhere near the lake. It wasn't perfect anymore, and that's what made it beautiful. Later that evening after dinner, I found myself alone on the porch again. The binder sat beside me, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Inside were the last remnants of Claudia's empire, documents, receipts, proof. I didn't need them anymore. Tomorrow, I'd send the originals to the state archive, and that would be the end of it. Lily joined me quietly, holding a small bronze plaque she'd made in her art class. The letters were carved with care. "Equal access is not a privilege." She handed it to me. "Can we put it here?" she asked. I swallowed hard and nodded. Together we mounted it at the base of the ramp. The screws turned slowly, biting into the wood with a sound that felt final. When we stepped back, the words caught the fading light perfectly. For the first time in months, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't need witnesses. I thought about all the people who'd been quiet before, afraid, uncertain, waiting for someone else to stand first. Maybe now they wouldn't wait. Maybe Silver Pines wasn't just a place where I won a fight. Maybe it was the beginning of something better. Lily leaned against me, watching the last light fade. "Do you think she'll go to jail?" I looked toward the horizon. "I think the law will do what it's supposed to. That's enough for me," she smiled. "Then we're finally free." I nodded. "Yeah, we are." If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.